The year is 60 AD. The sprawling empire of Rome, a colossal entity built on legions and law, believed it had brought order to the unruly island of Britannia. For nearly 2 decades, its legions had carved out a new province, taming tribal chieftains, building roads, and establishing the veneer of Roman civilization. But beneath this thin veneer, a primal rage simmered, a resentment born of conquest, taxation, and a profound cultural clash. And it was about to erupt, not in a mere skirmish or a localized revolt, but in an inferno of vengeance so absolute, so savagely unbridled, that it would shake the very foundations of Roman rule and leave an indelible stain on the annals of history. This is the story of Boudica, the warrior queen whose name would become synonymous with a wrath that Rome had never truly encountered. Her rebellion was not just a fight for freedom, it was a psychological eruption, a torrent of suffering unleashed upon those who had inflicted unspeakable pain. And what transpired in the months that followed her call to arms was a chapter of such grotesque brutality, such widespread devastation, that it still echoes across the centuries, a chilling testament to the human capacity for both enduring torment and inflicting it. To understand the ferocity of Boudica's uprising, we must first understand the ground zero of her fury. For nearly 2 decades, the Iceni, a powerful tribe in what is now East Anglia, had existed in a state of uneasy peace. Their king, Prasutagus, was a client king, bound by treaty to Rome, allowed to rule his people with a degree of autonomy so long as he served Roman interests. He had lived a long life, cultivated a reputation for immense wealth, and in his final act believed he had secured the future of his family and his tribe. In his will, Prasutagus, hoping to appease the insatiable Roman appetite for control, bequeathed half of his kingdom to Emperor Nero and the other half to his 2 daughters, ensuring a dual legacy and, he believed, a secure inheritance for his family. It was a common practice among client kings, a delicate dance of diplomacy meant to preserve tribal identity within the suffocating embrace of the empire. But Rome, as it so often did, saw only an opportunity for complete annexation. When Prasutagus drew his last breath, the carefully constructed facade of cooperation crumbled. Roman officials, their eyes fixed on the rich Iceni lands and their formidable treasury, descended upon the tribe not as allies, but as predators. The procurator, Quintus Decianus, a man whose avarice was legendary even among his fellow Romans, saw no reason to honor a barbarian's last wishes. The will was dismissed. The Iceni kingdom, in the Roman view, was now simply a province awaiting full absorption. And then came the unforgivable acts, the atrocities that would ignite the tinderbox of British resentment into a blazing inferno. Roman centurions, under orders from Decianus, moved in to seize Prasutagus' property, not just his public holdings, but his private estates, his ancestral wealth, and the very symbols of his royal authority. The Iceni nobility, who dared to protest, were stripped of their lands and enslaved. The most egregious violation, however, was reserved for Boudica and her daughters. Imagine, if you can, the scene. The proud queen, her face etched with grief for her recently departed husband, suddenly confronted by the brutal reality of Roman justice. She was publicly flogged, a ritual humiliation reserved for slaves and common criminals, a barbaric act intended to break her spirit and degrade her in the eyes of her people. And then, the ultimate horror, the unspeakable act that would forever scar her soul and fuel the subsequent torrent of vengeance. Her 2 young daughters were raped by Roman soldiers, defiled, their innocence shattered, their future irrevocably tainted. This was not simply a legal dispute or a political takeover. This was an act of calculated, savage dehumanization. It was a message delivered with whips and violation. You are nothing. Your traditions are nothing. Your dignity is nothing. Your very bodies are ours to command. Asterisk for Boudica, for the Iceni, for any Briton who heard these tales, it was an abomination, an insult so profound it demanded an equally profound response. The Roman contempt had gone too far. The quiet subservience of the Iceni was shattered, replaced by a seething cauldron of rage. Word of these outrages spread like wildfire. Across the land, the Iceni, a people known for their fierce independence, felt the sting of humiliation as if it were their own. But they were not alone in their suffering. The Trinovantes, another powerful tribe whose lands encompass the newly established Roman colony of Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, nursed their own bitter grievances. Camulodunum, the first Roman colonia in Britain, was a stark symbol of foreign domination. It was home to retired Roman legionaries, privileged and arrogant, who had dispossessed the local Britons of their land, built elaborate villas, and exacted heavy taxes. The most offensive structure of all was the colossal temple dedicated to the deified Emperor Claudius, a monument to Roman power and a drain on local resources, forcing the Britons to contribute to its upkeep and worship a dead emperor they despised. To the Britons, it was not a temple, but a citadel of eternal domination, as Tacitus would later describe it. The procurator, Quintus Decianus, was indeed the embodiment of Roman administrative arrogance and greed. His policies had been extortionate, his demands for taxes relentless, and his contempt for the Britons palpable. He had lent vast sums of money to the Britons, then called in the debts with impossible interest rates, driving many into servitude or utter destitution. Seneca, the philosopher and advisor to Nero, had himself called in a vast loan of 40 million sesterces at one stroke, an act that stripped many Britons of their assets and drove them to despair. This financial oppression, coupled with the land seizures and the desecration of Boudica's family, created an explosive cocktail of grievances. And so, the stage was set. Under the cloak of secrecy, messengers rode through the British hinterland, carrying the story of Boudica's humiliation, the rape of her daughters, and the plunder of the Iceni. The call for vengeance went out, and the tribes answered. Not just the Iceni and Trinovantes, but the Cantiasi, the Durotres, and others, long chafing under Roman rule, now found a unifying figure, a rallying cry in the form of a queen consumed by righteous fury. Tacitus describes Boudica as a woman of imposing stature, fierce in aspect, with a piercing gaze, a harsh voice, and a mass of fiery red hair that cascaded to her hips. She wore a golden torque around her neck and a multicolored tunic, a cloak fastened by a brooch. She was a figure of raw, untamed power, a living embodiment of the vengeance she promised. Before her assembled host, estimated to be well over 100,000 warriors, she mounted her war chariot, her daughters beside her, their faces still etched with the trauma of their ordeal. She raised her voice, a voice that carried the weight of her suffering and the promise of retribution. "We have been humiliated. My daughters have been defiled. Our lands have been stolen. And for what? So that Rome may grow richer, so that Roman veterans may live in luxury on our stolen soil. They call us barbarians. But who are the true barbarians? They who defile women and plunder the dead? No, we are Britons. We are free, and we will show these Romans the true meaning of wrath." Her speech, delivered with passionate conviction, was a potent blend of personal grievance and collective outrage. She spoke of the sacred obligations of chieftainship, now trampled by Rome. She invoked the spirits of their ancestors, shamed by the current state of servitude. She reminded them of their martial prowess, of their druidic beliefs, of the sacredness of their lands and their customs. The roar that met her words was a thunderous affirmation, a collective release of suppressed fury. The British Confederation was ready. Meanwhile, the Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was far away, leading his legions in a campaign against the Druids on the island of Mona, a stronghold of Celtic resistance and spiritual power. He was systematically destroying their sacred groves, burning their altars, and slaughtering the Druids, believing he was stamping out the heart of British rebellion. He was oblivious to the cataclysm brewing behind him. His procurator, Quintus Decianus, dismissed early warnings of unrest, confident in Rome's invincible power, attributing the grumbling to mere barbarian insolence. He was a fool. The first target of Boudica's wrath was Camulodunum, the former capital of the Trinovantes and now the hated Roman colony. Its inhabitants, mostly retired legionaries and Roman cities, were complacent, unfortified, and utterly unprepared. They were too confident in the Pax Romana, too arrogant to believe that these barbarians would truly rise. When the British hordes, a terrifying tide of painted warriors, their war cries echoing across the fields, descended upon Camulodunum, the residents were caught completely off guard. The city, though initially offering some resistance from within the Claudius Temple, was overwhelmed in a matter of days. The Britons, fueled by years of resentment and the immediate sting of Boudica's personal tragedy, showed no mercy. The Roman accounts, particularly Dio Cassius, paint a horrifying picture of the atrocities. Imagine the scene: a screaming inferno. The timber-framed Roman houses, grand symbols of their foreign occupation, quickly caught fire, sending plumes of black smoke churning into the sky. The air, thick with the stench of burning wood and flesh, vibrated with the shouts of the attackers, the screams of the dying, and the crackle of flames. Streets that had once bustled with Roman life became choked with fleeing citizens, desperate to escape, only to be cut down by British warriors who reveled in their vengeance. The Britons did not simply kill. They delighted in prolonging the agony of their victims, in making their deaths a spectacle of suffering. Dio Cassius chillingly details the gruesome methods employed. They hung up naked women and cut off their breasts and sewed them to their mouths in order to make the victims appear to be eating them. Afterwards, they impaled them on sharp skewers, and finally they crucified them. This was not just military strategy. It was ritualistic mutilation, designed to terrorize, to desecrate, to mirror the humiliation inflicted upon Boudica and her daughters. The altars of the Roman gods, the very symbols of their religious and imperial power, were stained with Roman blood, defiled in a grotesque reversal of sacred rites. The vast temple of Claudius, where the remaining Roman defenders had barricaded themselves, held out for 2 days before it, too, succumbed to the flames and the relentless British assault. Its marble facade cracked and crumbled, its very stone weeping under the heat, a grotesque monument to Roman hubris reduced to smoldering rubble. The archaeological evidence at Colchester corroborates these ancient accounts. Excavations have revealed a distinctive layer of reddish-brown ash and burnt debris, sometimes up to 3 feet thick, indicating widespread and intense destruction by fire in the mid-1st century AD. Within this Boudican destruction layer, archaeologists have found coins, pottery, and other artifacts melted and fused by extreme heat, alongside human remains bearing signs of violent death. The scale of the destruction was immense, a physical manifestation of the psychological tempest that had swept through the Roman colony. News of the massacre at Camulodunum finally reached Suetonius Paulinus, who was still engaged in the pacification of Mona. He recognized the gravity of the situation instantly. This was no ordinary rebellion. He immediately gathered his small force, primarily elements of the Legio XIV Gemina, and raced towards the heart of the uprising. He bypassed Camulodunum, knowing it was lost, and made a desperate dash for Londinium, a thriving commercial hub and a key Roman administrative center, though still a relatively new and unfortified settlement. Londinium, bustling with merchants, traders, and Roman citizens, was filled with a false sense of security. Its inhabitants believed Rome would protect them, but Suetonius Paulinus, arriving with his meager force, saw the overwhelming numerical superiority of the British horde. He made a brutal, pragmatic decision. Londinium could not be defended. To attempt to do so would risk his entire army, and with it, the very future of Roman Britain. He ordered an evacuation for those who could keep pace with his legions, but for the vast majority of the population, the weak, the old, the sick, and those who refused to abandon their homes, there was no hope. He left them to their fate. Those who preferred to remain, being hampered by the weakness of their sex, or the infirmity of age, or being attracted by the charm of the place, were cut off by the enemy, Tacitus grimly records. What unfolded next in Londinium was an even greater tragedy than Camulodunum. The Britons descended upon the city like a vengeful tidal wave. The streets became a terrifying labyrinth of slaughter. The air filled with the cries of the terrified, the clash of primitive weapons, and the relentless war chants of the Iceni and Trinovantes. This was not a quick battle. It was a methodical, bloody purge. The Britons systematically hunted down and killed every Roman and Romanized Briton they could find. Men, women, and children alike were subjected to the same horrifying fate. Dio Cassius again provides the most chilling details. They would hang women stark naked and cut off their breasts and sew them to their mouths to give the impression of eating them. He speaks of ritualistic sacrifices in sacred groves, of heads taken as trophies, of bodies impaled and mutilated. The psychological terror was paramount. The Britons were not simply killing, they were asserting dominance in the most brutal, visceral way possible, mirroring the violence they had endured. The archaeological record once again confirms the horror. Below the modern streets of London, specifically around Lombard Street and Cornhill, another thick layer of Boudican destruction has been found. This layer contains evidence of intensely burned buildings, charred timbers, and the telltale reddish-brown ash. Fragments of Roman military equipment found within this layer suggest a desperate, ultimately futile, struggle. The sheer extent of the burnt area implies that virtually the entire Roman settlement was put to the torch. The stench of death and burning lingered over the Thames for weeks, a macabre perfume of British vengeance. From Londinium, Boudica's enraged army marched northwest to Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans, another thriving Roman town, and a municipium granting its citizens Roman rights. Here, too, the pattern of destruction was repeated with grim efficiency. The Britons showed no distinction between civilian and soldier, between Roman citizen and Briton who had adopted Roman ways. Anyone associated with Rome was an enemy, to be purged with extreme prejudice. Verulamium, like its predecessors, was reduced to ashes, its inhabitants massacred with the same grotesque ferocity. Archaeological excavations at Verulamium have revealed a similar destruction layer, confirming the scale and intensity of the devastation. The sheer numbers were staggering. Tacitus reports that some 70,000 to 80,000 Romans and Romanized Britons perished in the three cities. Dio Cassius, prone to exaggeration but reflecting the shock of the time, suggests even higher figures. This was not just a rebellion. It was an act of demographic cleansing, a deliberate attempt to eradicate the Roman presence and reclaim the land through blood and fire. The Britons were driven by a profound primal rage, a deeply ingrained cultural memory of insult and domination finally exploding. Their savagery was a direct reflection of the Roman arrogance and brutality that had pushed them to the brink. The British uprising had achieved a level of destruction and terror that was unprecedented in Rome's experience with its conquered peoples. Fear gripped the Roman Empire. Emperor Nero, miles away in Rome, was reportedly terrified. He considered withdrawing all Roman forces from Britain, abandoning the province entirely. The very idea that barbarian tribes could inflict such a blow on the mighty legions was an affront, a sign of weakness in the very heart of their imperial power. But Suetonius Paulinus, a seasoned and ruthless commander, refused to yield. He understood that to retreat now would be to admit defeat, to invite further rebellion across the empire. He knew he had to crush Boudica, and he had to do it decisively. Suetonius Paulinus, with the remnants of his forces, about 10,000 legionaries, auxiliaries, and whatever fresh recruits he could muster, retreated to a strategically advantageous position. The exact location is debated, but it was likely a narrow defile or a natural amphitheater, with a thick forest behind him that prevented outflanking maneuvers and open ground in front. This terrain, he calculated, would neutralize the British numerical superiority and their reliance on massed charges and war chariots. It would also allow his disciplined legions to fight in their preferred tight formation. The contrast between the two armies could not have been starker. On one side, Suetonius Paulinus, cool and calculating, leading a compact force of professional soldiers, highly trained, disciplined, and armed with superior weaponry and tactics. Air morale, though shaken by the previous disasters, was bolstered by their commanders' stoicism and their belief in Roman military supremacy. On the other side, Boudica's army, estimates vary wildly, but it was enormous, perhaps 200,000 or even 300,000 strong. It was a vast, unwieldy host, a collection of tribes united by vengeance, but lacking cohesion, training, and strategic discipline. Many were not professional warriors, but farmers, villagers, women, and even children who had followed their leaders, their families, and their thirst for retribution. They had brought their families in wagons, parked at the rear, believing victory was assured, that they would witness the final triumph over Rome. This would prove to be a fatal decision. Before the battle, Boudica again addressed her warriors, her voice booming across the vast British host. She reminded them of the Roman atrocities, the rapes, the plunder, the desecration. She spoke of her own suffering, her lacerated body, her violated daughters, and she presented herself as a living testament to Roman injustice. "No longer do I rule as queen," she declared, "but as one of you. I am not fighting for my kingdom or for my vast wealth, but for freedom, for the rights of all, for a life better than slavery." She appealed to their pride, their sense of honor, their ancient tribal freedoms. Consider how many of us are fighting and why. We are going into battle for our freedom, and they for their slavery. We will not be defeated. We are more numerous and more inspired by vengeance. Suetonius Paulinus, too, addressed his troops. He acknowledged the terror and the setbacks, but he appealed to their Roman discipline, their training, their pride in the legions. He told them that numerical superiority meant nothing against Roman might. "Disregard the clamor of the barbarians, their empty threats," he urged them. "There are more women than warriors in their ranks. They are undisciplined, unreliable, and will break at the first charge. Stand your ground, hurl your javelins, then advance with swords and shields. This ground will be soaked with their blood." He ordered his men to hold their positions, to unleash a volley of pila at close range, then to charge, using their gladder to hack and thrust in the tight confines of the battle. The battle itself, though shrouded in the mists of time and reliant on often exaggerated Roman accounts, was likely a bloody masterpiece of Roman military efficiency against an uncoordinated tribal horde. The Britons, confident in their overwhelming numbers and their previous victories, surged forward, their war cries echoing across the valley, a cacophony of primal sound designed to strike terror into Roman hearts. They were a terrifying sight, painted and screaming, a human wave crashing against the disciplined Roman lines. But the legions held firm. As the British front lines approached, the Roman legionaries unleashed their volley of pila. Each heavy javelin, designed to penetrate shields and armor, or to bend on impact rendering shields useless, tore through the charging British ranks. The initial momentum of the British charge was broken, thousands falling, their bodies collapsing under the weight of the iron missiles. The front ranks became a confused mass of wounded and dying, tripping over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Before the Britons could recover, the Roman legions, maintaining their tight formation, advanced. The battle dissolved into a brutal close-quarters melee. The Roman gladius, a short stabbing sword, was devastatingly effective in the tight formations. The Roman soldiers, protected by their segmented lorica segmentata armor and large scutum shields, moved with practiced efficiency, thrusting, stabbing, and hacking. The Britons, armed with longer swords, spears, and axes, found their weapons less effective against the Roman shield wall, and their lack of heavy armor left them terribly exposed. The battle became a relentless grind. The sheer weight of numbers from the British side was immense, but it also became their undoing. As the first British lines faltered, those behind them, eager to join the fray, pressed forward, creating a deadly crush. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't utilize their numbers effectively. They were trapped, caught between the unyielding Roman shield wall and their own pressing ranks. The wagons at the rear, where the British families had gathered to witness the victory, now became an impenetrable baby barrier, trapping the fleeing Britons, turning retreat into a desperate, bloody slaughter. The Roman cavalry, held in reserve, swept around the flanks, cutting off any escape routes. What began as a battle quickly devolved into a massacre. Tacitus describes the carnage with chilling brevity. The Romans glutted themselves with slaughter. The Britons, caught in the trap, fell in swathes. The Roman legions, methodical and ruthless, cut them down with chilling efficiency. The ground became slick with blood, the air thick with the stench of carnage and the screams of the dying. The wails of the British women and children trapped in the wagon train added a horrifying symphony to the sounds of battle. The Roman accounts claim that almost 80,000 Britons were killed in the final battle, a staggering figure that, while likely exaggerated, reflects the truly devastating scale of the Roman victory. Only 400 Romans were reported killed, a testament to the brutal effectiveness of their military machine. The battle was not just a defeat for Boudica, it was the annihilation of the British resistance, the crushing of their spirit, and the definitive reassertion of Roman power. What happened to Boudica after this catastrophic defeat remains somewhat uncertain. Tacitus states that she poisoned herself to avoid capture, preferring death to the humiliation of becoming a Roman trophy. Dio Cassius, however, suggests she fell ill and died, and was given a magnificent burial. Given her previous actions, her unwavering defiance, and her profound understanding of Roman contempt, it is far more likely that she chose her own end rather than face capture and a public, humiliating execution, perhaps in Rome itself. Her death, whether by poison or illness, brought an end to the most savage and terrifying rebellion Rome had ever faced in Britain. The aftermath was grim. Suetonius Paulinus, now firmly back in control, was not content with merely winning the battle. He embarked on a punitive campaign of devastation, systematically burning crops, destroying villages, and slaughtering any remaining pockets of resistance. Famine and disease swept through the land, decimating the surviving British population. The vengeance cycle was complete. Rome, having endured a period of terror, now inflicted its own, equally brutal retribution. The Emperor Nero, initially considering abandonment, was now convinced of Britain's value and needed to secure its future. However, he also recognized that Paulinus's harshness, while effective in crushing the rebellion, was not conducive to long-term pacification. Paulinus was eventually replaced by a new governor, Publius Petronius Turpilianus, who adopted a more lenient, conciliatory policy, aiming to rebuild the province and foster a sense of stability. The lessons of Boudica's revolt, the devastating consequences of Roman greed and insensitivity, had been learned, albeit at a terrible cost in lives and destruction. Boudica's rebellion, for all its horrifying violence, transformed Roman Britain. The Romans realized they could not simply exploit the province. They had to integrate it, build infrastructure, foster trade, and manage the tribal populations with more nuance. Londinium and Verulamium were rebuilt, often with stronger defenses and in more Romanized styles, quickly regaining their prominence as centers of commerce and administration. Romanization efforts were intensified, but with a greater understanding of the volatile undercurrents of British resentment. The story of Boudica is more than just a tale of ancient warfare. It is a profound exploration of human suffering, vengeance, and the clash of civilizations. It forces us to confront the brutal realities of imperial conquest, where the pursuit of power and wealth often leads to unspeakable atrocities, and where those oppressed can, in turn, unleash a fury that mirrors the very violence they have endured. Boudica herself, often portrayed as a heroic freedom fighter in modern British popular culture, was undoubtedly a figure of immense strength and courage. But the historical accounts also reveal a woman consumed by a raw, unyielding vengeance that led to mass slaughter and widespread destruction. Her rebellion was a testament to the devastating consequences of pushing a people beyond endurance, of stripping away their dignity, and of violating their most sacred bonds. Her name, Boudica, meaning victory in ancient Celtic, ironically crowned a catastrophic defeat for her people. Yet, her legacy endures not just as a symbol of resistance against oppression, but as a chilling reminder of the cyclical nature of violence, where every act of cruelty can ignite a retaliatory firestorm. The screams of Londinium, the fires of Camulodunum, the blood-soaked plains of her final battle. These are the visceral, unsettling details that reveal the true face of Boudica's vengeance. It was a wrath, so savage, so absolute, that it seared itself into the memory of both victim and victor. A terrifying chapter in the grand, often gruesome, narrative of the Roman Empire and the unconquered spirit of Britannia. And it reminds us that even the most formidable empires can be shaken to their core when the oppressed finally find their voice and unleash their fury.